Okay, now we're actually having to do a redo of part two. I guess I used too much of the video and stuff and everything onto it, but I implore you as a separate adventure. He said some funny things and stuff, and it would be good to watch this also. Uh, it's shown here at the bottom. Irving Finkel, The Ark Before Noah, a great adventure. For I'm just gonna be able to vamp on it and go through the pictures now at this point and try to finish it. Although it'll probably make it a quicker portrayal of what I was trying to show. Let's go ahead and go into full screen now that we can and just look at the pictures here. And what he's describing here is how they've taken and made these fingers of rope that are out of this. Now, what got left out of this part two that I already have to explain to you is that he described at the very end of the last one that it was 14,430 sutu of rope that were going to end up making the ark that saved all of humanity. Right? Well, this ends up showing up in sacred geometry, in the measurements of the earth and the distances to the sun. And you know how we talk about how there's a fractal geometry that kind of works with everything on the planet, from pine cones all the way up and all of those type things, and it fits into that situation too. And so that's part of the sacred geometry that people are unaware of that ends up adding it into it. And I'm going to do a series coming up on it that explains everything too, but I feel like I need to get a couple of situations that describe these numbers too in our pocket before we jump into that, because it's a bit overwhelming, and it's just a bunch of numbers and things and correlations, but it just keeps going and going and going. And it's odd. You can find this point of going and going and going, and then all of a sudden go, well, let's apply this for a minute. And you can see how it works on the pyramid and the size of the earth and all of this knowledge that people knew way back when. There was this sacred knowledge that's been kept, and some more of that veil disappears that we've been talking about. But what they start out here with is with a coil of rope, and it's very much like one of my mom's old front hallway rugs that they had gotten, except for it's made much thicker. This is about 4 inches thick, and this rope is about the size of your finger, and it looks like this, but it's about that thick, and they're taking and rolling it up, and they continue and continue and continue and roll, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this measurement of 14,430 sutu, they figured out that it, in reality, if they were to go for the exact inch on what it would take, this man that he got, that's some super mathematician, figured out that it would actually take a few sutu less than that, but right at it. And it leaves off some 30 sutu worth of measurement. But someone else has already made a video critiquing this and talking about that whenever they wove two pieces of rope together, that they overlapped over 2 foot, and so it doesn't sound like that much, but they were making one single center or heart of these palm trees into ropes and then attaching them together, and so 2 foot times how many thousands adds up. This 14,430 sutu adds up to be like 527 kilometers. He makes a joke about it, but it's like Edinburgh to London. It's like Chicago to Minneapolis, Minnesota, but you got left over some 30 sutu, and he said, I'll leave that to you to figure out. But you can imagine the daunting task and the concept here. But this ark is not even made out of wood except for the ribs on the internal. And that's what I was talking about at the end of the last one. And then the second part was that they show you that they have these ribs, and what they've done is stitched these ribs of wood that are arched made to match this, and they put these ribs inside of there and then stitched this rope as it's gone around and made this basket to it. Then they bitumen it from the inside and bitumen it from the outside afterwards, making sure that first it holds water from the inside and doesn't just leak out. So they seal it one way, then they dry it all out, then they seal it from the other side to be for sure. And here's a picture of the fact that they realized that by the time they make this, that it was not going to be able to be even done correctly, and that they have told him that they have to make it much smaller than the original dimensions. So this thing that I'm fixing to show you is actually about half, or a little more than half, but the size of the one that is described by Enki to Atrahasis in the original tale that comes down to us as the Noah's flood and the Ark and those situations. Here we can see where they are starting the bitumen from the inside, and it leaks through all the light gaps that they can see, and then they sit there and look up under it and see if they can see light from any places and try to repatch it. And after they've repatched it, so much has come through, it starts to be on the bottom. But this thing had too much weight to it, so they had to make a cradle to be able to drag it into the water. But in reality, the original one didn't have this problem, right? It sat right there until it flooded over and it lifted up and it kept going. Oddity to the situation, they tell you that it lands in Arata, which has come down to us as Ararat in the Bible, and that's in the Caucasus Mountains over there. And so instead of washing out to the sea with the flood that came through, they somehow ended up ending in that area. And it shows you a heritage in what had happened after the flood. Some people see this as a two-part story, and I definitely believe in that there was this flood before that happened, and this was the Younger Dryas event that drove them down, but they found the promised land already. And the plains of Sumeria between the Tigris and Euphrates, just like it talks about in Genesis, were called Eden. It's E-D-I-N instead of E-D-E-N, but it's the same word. And so all these correlations are made. I mean, Abraham came from Ur and all these things, and they say, well, it was Ur that's deep down in Sumeria, or was it Ur-Uratu that's up more in Anatolia, still off the Tigris and Euphrates, still in between, or does it encompass all of this? And it looks like it encompasses all of this at this point. And so that leads some reality to the biblical story and who it was supposed to denote and where it came from. He makes some cool jokes here about this elephant that helped him out and stuff, and do these people at this time utilize elephants? Well, there's some in the art, but it isn't shown that they're utilized a lot. And I wish I could just flip to it right now, but I've got an old video where I show you where they actually built these giant reed castles, if you will. It looks like modern day resorts you would find on Tahiti or someplace. And they show you that on tablets from 4000 BC, before writing really came into being, a picture of something that looks exactly like these giant reed houses that they had building. And how long did it go on before then? Well, the proto-Sumerians seem to date back into 7,000-8,000 BC perhaps. It comes in at that range, or 7,000-8,000 years ago. 6,000 BC maximum, 5,200 or so, and they've got some good stuff going on. But this is a tale of a time before time. They tell you in their tale that this is a story from long, long ago. And when they say something like that, they're saying, well, it's not from long ago like you're thinking. They're telling you this is in the Wayback Machine. This is a view of the inside of it, and exactly as it is described, where they have these ribs that are all going up in here, helping the inside of that basket, and they are stitched around with rope that are holding that. There are wood planks that are stitched around the outside of that. There are boards that are driven in, one board cut through, driven in one board but not two. This is a double board situation, and they overlap, giving strength, right? So like bricks, to where they're half on the other one and stuff and wrapping around. And then these columns, and the very top of these columns actually have this holder that's kind of like this. It's holding up the wood stanchions that are up top, and that's the top of the ark. And then on the center of the ark, they build that house for Atrahasis to live in, and there's your Noah's ark. And it is a circular build. There's a lot more to this that I could say during this, and it would just draw it out to 3 or 4 videos. But if you'll watch his presentation on it, it's pretty funny. I had some clever things to say during it, but it looks like we're missing most of those, and I'm trying to describe them to you now so we can fit this into there. But that's them applying this bitumen that's there that you can see. But they say that he himself tells you that this is not the good or rocky bitumen that has this super waterproofing environment because it's full of petroleum. But this is some of the same type of tar they find from India, and it's not near as good. But they utilize it anyhow, and because of that, the boat ends up leaking just a little bit here and whenever they first take it out. But they said, well, all boats are going to leak. But in the effect, there would be somebody that would be able to be ditching out the water and doing these type of things. So here's a look at it whenever he first gets to go onto it, and the first different people that are here. And this is a small version of that reed hut house that I was talking about that's much bigger, but it's huge anyhow, or a decent sized hut for anybody to live in. But again, he mentions how they had to cut down the size of this thing in about half, and we're going to see just how big it is. Here, those ribs coming up and the cabling and stuff that goes, and the way that it looks. There's ladders that they had made to come up and go into this thing, and so pretty neat. Let's look. So his idea was that he wanted to get a couple of rhinos. And of course, now he knows very well that he looks kind of Noah-ish in our thoughts of what Noah looks like. But he was going to have these stand on the ramp to go up into there, and then give one of them a pat on the ass and then go with it. And they said, no, we're not going to be able to put any animals. And he goes, no, how about people in India where they can build something fake that looks like this? And can we have representation of a few animals? And then in the pins on the inside, so we're trying to make it realistic. And then they found out through all of this litigation that there was going to be so much problem and insurance of millions of dollars and all this that they'd have to put up to try to do something like that. And so they balk on it, which is another disappointing adventure, to say the least. And so now we see the size of this thing that's there, and it really doesn't do it justice. But this would have a hard time fitting in a basketball court, and the original one would have a hard time fitting on a football field, for it would actually go off the sides of the football field a little bit, not quite to the end zone on either side, of course, but huge. It would take up, and it looks more like a stadium and a boat and a UFO, if you will. You can see these stanchions that are running through here, and they were all worried that it wouldn't even hold water. And he goes, well, everything they make this out of is floatable, so even if it tries to sink, it will float, so everything should be okay. But they, again, the bureaucracy of making a movie and doing so on, and they got these blow-up bits that they use for ships and things, and so they have it set up on that crate type device, and they're put these blow-ups in it, lifted it up off of it, and then they're going to pull it along here out and into the water. Again, I say the original one would have just set right here till it flooded up and then drifted out and floated off, right? And there's some important things that I'm going to miss in here, other than him talking about slapping the donkeys on the or the rhinoceroses, which is the unicorn, by the way. Unicornus is the Latin name of the one-horned rhino, and it's always been what that was. The fabled tale of a unicorn is something that I've shown in a couple of other videos, and how it all pulls in between, and the magicness of it that leads all the way to the Norse people. And the reason that we have that unicorn with that horn that looks like that twisted spiral is a narwhal's horn, and things that were sold for back to ancient magic times. Weird effect here. narwhal horns, and amber. By the way, you can take an amber rod and rub on it, and then you get that effect where if you walk around the carpet, you can shock somebody with your finger. That effect happens out of it, and they were magic wands and all this type of thing. And so you can see how big this thing is and how it dwarfs it. And they're drawing it out into the water. And once they finally get it out here, he talks about how it had been not really raining at all, but as soon as they tried to pull this ark out of here, how all of a sudden it started to show up all these clouds, and that people thought that he had something to do with it. And before they launched this large group of people, first they had him film him coming in, seeing it for the first time, because they wouldn't let him be involved, which kind of sucked. But whenever he showed up and he showed his arrangement, he said he almost broke in tears in realization that this was real, that this was something that was more like the real story, that this whole giraffe poking out thing and the stuff we see and think of today is non-existent, but this had been something that was there. And there were tales of the Greeks to where this type of boat with its bitumen that was on it, and people would pick off pieces of bitumen and make charms that are much like St. Patrick's charms and the way we think of things like that today, until eventually the boat was all picked away. But that's another thing. Let's if I was to go into every little deep aspect of this, it would be quite the endeavor and quite the length of a video, so I'm not going to be able to go into this. But when we look at this head on right here coming at you, it's weird, but the boat doesn't make a wake in any way, even though they're pulling it along. But also, I mean, other than that, it would just be a raft and left up to the whim of chance, right? There are apparently no sails or anything going on to it, and you could use something and put it up like a sail, but there is nothing indicated to be of that nature. But this ball with the top cut off that all these people are on, and you can see they've got 35, 40 people on there, and they had to pay thousands and thousands for each person. Like the insurance for them to be able to do this tow out thing was like $1 million. She had to pay an insurance just to pull this off, because it's a movie and that type of thing. But you can see the environment and how this coming down the Euphrates, or little tributaries, or whatever it is that leads up to it, and what it shows, and the hut that's in between it and stuff that's on there. Oh no. So they worried if there was water coming in there, and they ended up having to take this hand crank type pump to take the water out of the bottom of it. And he tells them, every boat that you get in has water coming in it. There would always be water. There is not this super waterproof deal. But if we would use the correct bitumen, it would be a lot more sealed than it is today. And so this way that it looks there and the way that it looks there, if you look at that look and you put a giraffe here on the deck of this thing, that's pretty much the one that's in the children's story. And isn't it amazing that slightly it was saved in that concept that's there? And looking down on it here, you can see it across, but in reality the real one would have barely fit in here. It would have been more like this. It'd been huge. They had to make it much smaller. Here's a little house, and they left out these portions here, which is dangerous, but they did it so they could see down in it in certain parts. They didn't wall it off or do anything like that. They just left out the flooring that's in certain places it could be, and then around the edge, pretty wide, they left room for people to walk. So that was some type of danger. And he tells you everybody had to wear flotation devices and all kinds of stuff, regardless of whether they had a swimming merit badge or not. And the reason they chose this exact area too is that this water's not even really deep. That you can, in a lot of places, you can stand up in it, especially at the non-rainy time of the season. All these people came out to see him, and they were wanting to take pictures with him and stuff like that. And he was wearing, under his stuff, a Noah-ish type outfit or whatever. You can tell by his look that he has that look. So he said, wasn't that great how they all and they kind of hooped it up about me and stuff and everything. at that deal, and the guy looked over at him and he goes, they all thought you were Noah's children or some offspring of Noah, don't you? You could tell it. So all the people from India there were all getting into the idea. So he makes more joke, they right after he came out with his thing, Noah found Noah's Ark on Mars, but then they didn't use the round boat. But then that little stanchions that they show on the external part of the Ark that you see in depictions like that would have been internal. And amazingly, it is a boat made of rope. One thing I mentioned in part 2, they talk about it being the rope having to be cored out of all these date palm trees, but there's been some dude that says the rope would have been perhaps made of hemp because that's a lot stronger. There's no indication of that necessarily, and they surely don't mention it, that they're using cannabis or cannabis as we know of it today. But that was the incredible rope, and most of the ships that we know about in ancient times that you've ever heard of, and things about the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of those, the roping that was used for those in the Phoenician ships, and in fact in the canvas of the sails and the ropes that were on the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria were all made of hemp. And quite a few canvases that famous artworks are on that you're thinking of right now were made on a hemp type of canvas. He's showing you the interesting thing here. They have found a map of the world, and this is not supposed to be realistic like we draw realistic maps today, but it's pretty much symbolic in areas. And what's interesting here in the depiction is you can see there are arrow points going out in a radius, and we only have the information in some of them, but the fact that Arata and the Lord of Arat, and where it even says if you go on here that you'll find the land that they came from, right? What's odd about that, in a strange way, if you look at it, they say all the Babylonian lands are all of this, so they're kind of considering it the earth. There's no sign of the Mediterranean, but it does say out here they have this retinue. That's it, but don't show up coming in. This is the Tigris and Euphrates coming in. People say this was a canal that was made to meet here. This is the inside of the city, and they thought it was a wall. No, in the wall it says that that's salt water, and there are oceans around this, that they live on the giant island continent. This would have been all of Eurasia, and they came from something that's around, curved on the other side of the earth. He describes it in here too, how they make it, the world is round, and that they knew the world was round then. And when we go into my sacred geometry thing, I'll show and prove that they knew the world was round, and how it seems like man refound this 4 times through recorded history. And like, was it lost at times, or was there just certain people that only knew the knowledge, and other people were led to believe something like the world was flat? Like in the Bible, it describes a flat earth. Of course, it describes a different shaped ark and different things on that, but scholars have looked through that and realized that this is where it actually comes from. He talks here about a certain size of wooden blocks as thick as a parsiktu, and using certain, and this is what the ribs were going to be made out of, that they would be made of the heart of one of these trees, and they'd have to be from that thick. And it shows you that this is where the ark came to rest here, and they were among the mountains of Ararat. And so it describes this in Atrahasis. Now this is seen in the Gilgamesh epic on the far reach that Gilgamesh had to go and see him again, for he went and met Atrahasis, because Atrahasis was given long life. In fact, his next incarnation by the Akkadian tales is Utnapishtim, and which means he's been given extra life or long life, and he's supposed to have been somewhat immortal. Gilgamesh looks for immortality, and so that encompasses that tale too in an area there. Well, people have looked at this, and what it denotes, this mountain starting out here and these mountains here, and it isn't the other side of the world. It's just leading up in Anatolian lands. And you can see it kind of bends, but in reality it kind of hooks over a little more. But leads up in Anatolian lands, and where this is, and then where this guy would have landed was off in the east, and maybe as far and aiming out in the direction of these ancient pyramids that are found there, and the Tarim Basin mummies and so on like that. That's more that direction than this direction here, which it denotes. So, interesting fact here, he ends on a funny note, but if you'll look at the ribbings and the way that they build houses, it's pretty much an upside down boat. And I showed last year where they figured out that pretty much the Mayflower has been made into a barn, and that quite often they made barns. But you can also look at all those Proto-Indo-European houses and how they have the little cross. I can't do it with my fingers, now I'm aiming the wrong way. A little cross at the top of it, which are boards, usually kind of bent and swooped up. One's like this, one comes from the other side, and effectively that is utilizing a boat into making a house. A houseboat. Isn't that unique? Well, when we hear about the Proto-Indo-Europeans, how they used to be able to take their house like a yurt and they put it on a stanza with huge wheels on it, and they would drag them across the countryside, effectively a city on the move. And these stories that were told about it too, but then you come to find out that it wouldn't take much for you to bitumen up one of these yurts. And then we have that same circular form and that same concept on what had happened way before and way after. He talks about how this bird up here hasn't been here for long because there's no poop all where he's found nothing fresh. And when he found this old church here, he went up and the bird pooped on him, and he looked up at it, and it's a white dove, and he says, I have a good idea who sent that bird to poop on me. And what would it have been? Well, it would have been the Christian God that we believe with this story about the arks, because he was somebody that showed that that wasn't true, and the reality of where that all comes from. Now, in my studies, I of course found that the Bible gets totally destroyed, and I've showed little portions of that, and I really don't want to go there necessarily. It was the last thing I tried to take on because it has so much bravado and too many apologetics and people going for it and everything. But I have tried to show some dissected points out of it that relate to where it all comes from in this story. But shortly we're going to get into a concept of the 12 tribes and where all those went to. And that's going to show you that it all encompasses all of these Proto-Indo-Europeans and the people that were the Europeans and everybody of the known world at that time, just like it says in the Bible. So there's so much truth in it, but also there's so many things taken out of conjecture, stolen from other pagan beliefs that, oh, you can't say that, and it's not, oh, no, it's a thing and a heritage that comes from way back and leads all the way through. And I think even though it destroys the concept of the Bible, and I can do the New Testament too with Jesus and when Armageddon happened and already happened and all that crap, but not only does it destroy the Bible, but at the same time it shows you a heritage that comes from a time before time that led all into it, that is a stronger and richer heritage that doesn't try to pinpoint one people out of 12 or 13 that ended up being somebody special that was so selected, but the real true people that had been selected from long ago, and their trials and tribulations they went through. And really it's just kind of the example of the last of the Mohicans and what happens, and whenever you find that it folds and leads into the Roman Catholic Church, and which Rome falls and becomes that, and it still exists today. and leads into the modern time, and it's kind of where it all comes from. I had a couple more cool things I wanted to mention, and I have spaced them out. But in a nutshell, no pun intended, this effectively is people writing in a nutshell in an ark. And an ark was meant to keep something sacred. And so in a funny way, it did halfway keep this idea of what was sacred. And it's amazing how we rode through to a modern time now and finding back, and it's taken at least 2,000 years for people to start to peer through the fog and see versus what you were led to believe versus what really happened. And that's all this channel has really been about. Like, share, subscribe, and enjoy, and we'll get on to the next incarnation. Do take a look at his video here. It's just under an hour, but it's very entertaining, especially if you want to see more into it and stuff. But the fact of it being 14,430 Sutu is extremely telling, and I'm fixing to show you how that connects to sacred geometry and how these people knew so much more than you even think that they knew way back when. It seems to come out of nowhere, but it doesn't in actuality. Peace.